Terrence is a professor of history at Hillsdale College, a former Marine with a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. He served as the founding principal of a top K-12 classical school in Colorado and advises Hillsdale Charter School and providing assistance with the formation of classical charter schools across the country. He joined the Common Core repeal effort in 2013 and has testified before several state legislators. Dr. Moore is the author of The Perfect Game and The Story Killers, a common sense case against the Common Core. Those, I believe, are available out after the event is over as well. Give a Buckeye welcome to Dr. Terrence.
Okay, how are y'all doing? Okay, I can't resist. The grammarian in me wants to say that you're doing well. But if you're defeating the Common Core, you're doing good. So it's great to be here in Ohio. I want to thank Heidi and Tia for putting this on. And also Erin Tuttle, this woman right here who brought me into the Common Core debate about a year ago. Thank you. It's given me a part-time job. And what I would also like to thank is the state of Ohio for giving me my wife. But let's do something fun. Are y'all ready for a Common Core pop quiz? Okay, very well. Even if you're not, I'm going to give it. So this is a standard. This is a Common Core standard. We hear a lot about standards. We hear about them in general, and we hear how this is really a good set of standards, and districts are left to do whatever kind of curriculum they want to. And we're raising the bar, are we not, from what Ohio had before by these new Common Core standards? Well, here's one. This is Common Core RF.K.3b, which stands for Reading Foundation Standard, Kindergarten, Third Standard B. Associate the long and short sounds with the common spellings, graphemes, for the 5 major vowels. Now you probably think, I'm going to read that again, you probably think you know what that means. Associate the long and short sounds with the common spellings for the 5 major vowels. Oh, one person has got it. So what you think is, okay, we're learning the vowels and we're learning their long and short sounds, right? Read it one more time. Associate the long and short sounds with the common spellings of the 5 major vowels. Okay, so here's your quiz. A is a vowel. How many ways are there to spell the letter A? 1. I don't get that. That's the joke that somebody said the other day. Okay, A, if you're from Canada. Thank you. It's clear now. So, but apparently the authors of the Common Core think that there must be multiple ways to spell those vowels. Well, let's go on to a different standard. This is RF.K.3a, the standard that just comes right before it. Demonstrate basic knowledge of one-to-one letter-sound correspondences by producing the primary sound or many of the most frequent sounds of each consonant. Again, I have to read this again. It's too convoluted to understand. Demonstrate basic knowledge of one-to-one letter-sound correspondences. That's actually okay. You see a letter, it has sounds associated with it. You're pronouncing the letter. No problem there. By producing the primary sound or many of the most frequent sounds of each consonant. What I read many to mean is more than 3. So here's your quiz question. Name me a consonant that has more than 3 sounds. There aren't any. The letter B, for example, has 1 sound. B. The letter P has 1 sound. The letter C has 2 main sounds, k as in cook, C as in city, and then in a very few foreign words, like the word cello, you have another sound. Otherwise, C, if it's operating like the word special, it's operating as a phonogram, not as a single consonant. So what we're saying here is that the people who wrote these standards don't understand the vowels. They don't understand the consonants. What part of the alphabet did they get right? that, how many more things are they going to end up messing up in the Common Core standards? That's the problem. Now, these standards we're going to go into, but I want to summarize the English standards very quickly. Okay? The early elementary standards, K and 1, or they look like they're trying to teach reading, but they're teaching reading through a whole language program that's in drag. That they're trying to disguise to make it look like it's phonics, but it's not phonics. That's the first thing. In the elementary school, when they suggest the readings that the students should read, they're suggesting extremely forgettable and unimportant things that will be in the kid's mind and out by the end of the time he's read. Nothing great. By the time we get into the upper school, what they're really doing is they're taking away literature from literature class. And so this is where I come up with the phrase, the authors of the Common Core are story killers. Because, and they say this is in the opening pages of the English standards. They don't come out and say, we're trying to take literature out of literature classes. Because that wouldn't be very popular. What they say instead is, well, we're going to have fewer literary texts than have traditionally been the case. And we're going to add in informational texts. And by the time you get to be a senior in high school, you will read 70% informational texts and only 30% literary texts. I'll tell you what the reasoning is behind that, but here's the effect. They're killing off the great stories of a great people, the American people. And when I speak to legislators across the country, with the exception of these two gentlemen up here, and some other folks who are good guys like Senator Schneider in Indiana, they just sort of give me this funny look, as though I'm a professor, and this is a very erudite thing to think about. But what you have to understand about stories is something that Plato taught us over 2,000 years ago, which is whoever controls the stories of a society controls the society. It's called the narrative. Whoever writes the stories and is in charge of writing them gets to determine how the regime works. Whoever controls the language controls how the regime works. So when you take away our stories and feed us a bunch of schlock, you're up to something. And admittedly, it's hard to know where incompetence ends and where ideology begins. But that's what's going on with the literature curriculum. And you have to ask yourself, why would people do it? Why would America say, take away our great literature, take away our great stories, take away Twain, take away Shakespeare? Who would stand up for that? Well, nobody. Which is why you have to have the complicated, ridiculous document that is the Common Core English Standards to confuse people and to trick people into doing this very thing. And so what I hope to do tonight is just to work through the Common Core English Standards to expose how ridiculous they are and to give you real evidence, because the other side's always saying, where's the evidence? To give you real evidence about what's going on so you can go out and fight this with your legislators and with your school board members, because these people are elected and they can be unelected. So the first mistake they make is they just tell you what the aims of education are. And they have a few really favorite phrases. One is 21st century global economy. Another phrase is college and career readiness. They also like the phrase what it means to be a literate person in the 21st century. And all this sort of stuff. Now, here again, they just think that we're going to stand up and we're going to say, that's exactly what we want. We want a 21st century literacy as opposed to, say, a 20th century literacy. How many of you learned to read in the 20th century? Did you become illiterate at Y2K? Chances are, the people who are being trained, think about this in the 21st century, are becoming illiterate. Because the way all this new information is being shared, it seems like to me that what we're doing is we're texting each other 3-letter codes that are nothing better than high-tech smoke signals. I know a second grade teacher who overheard a kindergartner the other day using the phrase, you know these 3-letter text things that you get, using the phrase WTF. The girl had no idea what she was saying. The teacher asked, and she said, I just hear my mom say that. To which I say, WTF indeed. Because the purpose of the school, what may ever go on in the home, and we hope it's better than what goes on in the school, but the purpose of the school is to teach the English language at its highest level and its highest standard. This business of college and career readiness, when did this become the aim of education? I never actually heard the phrase, and I've been in the educational game for a long time. I never heard the phrase till about 3 years ago. College and career readiness. It's drummed into our heads over and over again. And especially with the emphasis on career readiness. Well, let me do a simple question here. Let me take a sample. How many of you have a profession that is in music? How many of you are professional musicians in this audience? Nobody. And this is a big crowd. Okay, well, so what? Well, if your education is about college and career readiness, there aren't very many careers in music, are there? Apparently. I mean, there are a few. But most people are not going into a career of music, so guess what goes away in the elementary schools? The music program. Right? Because it doesn't fit in with our college and career readiness pattern. Now let me ask you this question. How many of you, and better yet, how many of your children have this thing called a soul? Okay, please raise your hand. I hope so. Even the politician. No. Everyone. Representative Thompson, how are you, sir? So everyone. You got to have a lot of soul to be doing what Representative Thompson has to try to repeal this thing. At any rate, well, what is a better way to educate the human soul than music? And with the beauty that is found in music. Not to mention the fact that music is entirely mathematical. So the idea of ripping it out of the curriculum because it doesn't fit to some standardized testing and because we're supposed to be working them so hard in math is ridiculous. The number of math, music double majors it's astronomical. There are lots of them because the two things fit together. So at any rate, this whole business about college and career readiness, that needs to go away, frankly. And we need to have a renewed discussion about what the real aims of education are, which in the history of this country have been knowledge, beauty, virtue, learning, freedom. That's what I want my children to have. And those things can be taught at a very early age. When I hand my child a book, if he's 7 years old, and it's, what is he reading at 7? Fairy tales, which he loves, fables. My older child is going all the way through the Harry Potter series, and he's only 9. But he loves classic fairy tales. He loves Robinson Crusoe. Do I hand that book to my children and say, "Here, kid, this will make you college and career ready"? That's nonsense. He reads it because he's in this imaginative world, and both of them think these things are going on. And doing that is how they learn to be human. So we do need to have a fight about the philosophical aims of education, and they ain't college and career readiness, and I say that as a college professor. So we get beyond the aims of education, which would mess up in the Common Core standards, and then we get to the standards themselves, of which I've given you a taste. How many of you have tried to read the standards? Looked them up, read them, spent nights over them, over coffee. Did you have any success in that effort? No, of course not. No sensible human being could possibly read those things and divine anything from them, other than the fact that educationese is a false language, and the people who are behind it must be telling us something that's not the truth. And anybody who wants to say that these are great standards, I invite them, Fordham Institute, elected officials, whoever, let's have a real debate over the standards, and let's work through the standards standard by standard and translate them into my favorite standard, and contrary to what I was accused of today on the radio, I am not cherry-picking. This standard is all over the Common Core. It's in there 10, 15 times. It's standard RL-2.9, which means Reading Standard for Literature, 2nd grade standard 9, though it's duplicated in the 3rd grade, the 4th grade, the 5th grade, and so on and so forth. It reads as follows. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. It's just poetry, isn't it? It just rolls off the tongue. By the end of the year, come on, people, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Deep, isn't it? What does it really mean? Well, let's translate it. By the end of the year, okay, fair enough, by the end of the second grade year, read and comprehend literature. We understand that. So far, so good. In the grades, including stories and poetry. You know what? Literature does include stories and poetry. In the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently. Well, all they've done is taken second and third grade, as they do with all the grades. They've combined them. They've called it a complexity band, inserting the word complex, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they refer to grade levels as though there's some scientific thing. With scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Scaffolding. If you're in education circles, you know what I'm talking about, because the last couple of 3 years, scaffolding has been the buzzword. It's simply taken from the metaphor of scaffolding that you would use to erect a structure. You have the scaffolding. As the structure goes up, you need it. Once the scaffolding goes away, the structure stands on its own accord. In the old days, we called scaffolding teaching. You could even translate it as help. So let's redo this standard. Let's translate it into real English. Again, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding needed at the high end of the range. Or, students in second grade should read and understand more difficult books at the end of the year than at the beginning. They may need help, though. See, y'all get these jokes. I tried this today with a bunch of legislators, and only those two gentlemen were laughing. And Representative Thompson. Aristotle said that there's a connection between a sense of humor and intelligence. So clearly y'all are an intelligent audience here. No, I'm not going to keep it. Okay, so let's take up this business. So there are the standards, which I think are just window dressing, frankly, to get other things into the curriculum. But I will say that if you go through the standards, what you find in summary form are a host of common sense observations that should never be written into anything called a standard, like what we've just encountered. Things that are factually inaccurate, like the A's and how many sounds they make, or how many ways they can be spelled. And then, on top of that, the requirement of a lot of progressive teaching strategies and teaching methods that have been around for a long time and that have failed, like some of the ones that we heard before, like all this pseudo-classroom discussion where you take votes and cooperation among the students and you work in groups and all that. That's just dictating old progressive group work. And then some highly concrete, a lot of technology. They want a computer on every desk. They want a device in every hand. So there's a lot of progressivism going on. And then the final thing is, there are, it's harder to detect in the standards themselves, but there are words that are politically charged that are trying to produce political bias. Such as the word diverse or diversity. And this is really the first of one of my Common Core drinking games. When you're reading these standards late at night, if you're in college, maybe you did this in college. At Hillsdale College, there is no drinking game. But whenever you get to the word diversity, take a shot. And some of you ladies that are up there, texting and doing stuff and researching this stuff at 2 a.m., at least you will get some sleep that night. Because y'all are just staying up way too late. I get emails at all hours. So at any rate, but how do they justify this? Let's talk about this complexity nonsense. What they're saying, the way that they get these informational texts in there, is they say, well, you have to read complex texts. And the higher students go in their grade level, the more complex the texts have to be. As though that's a revelation. they doing with the word complexity, though? Well, there's actually a pseudoscience behind the word complexity, and it all has to do with this model that they've used to determine complexity. It's called the Lexile framework. The Lexile framework is some weird computer model that they crunch a text into it, and out comes out data, supposedly, that says this is where the text rates in terms of complexity. There's several problems. First of all, why would you ever do this to literature? I don't look at an algebra problem and say, that algebra problem doesn't have quite the sense of humor that Mark Twain has. So why would you subject literature to a computer model? Even so, the Lexile framework is wildly inaccurate. So take John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, all 583 pages of it. Where would you put that in terms of grade level reading? Where do you think? Senior in high school, okay? Junior, maybe the lowest would be a freshman. Try the second or third grade. Yeah, you're surprised too. Well, that's what the Lexile framework says. Second to third grade banned. Why? Well, it's very clear what's behind the Lexile framework. They are devaluing great literature that is written in pretty simple English prose. The language is simple. There are no really difficult words. There's no jargon. It's beautifully written. The themes are complex, but it's English. Whereas if you take any kind of jargon written in the latest journal article, that gets this artificially high rating. See what's going on? And think about, for example, the best example for this is the opening chapters of Genesis, which are written in language that any child can really understand. But then think about the themes that are behind the opening chapters of Genesis. The creation of the universe and the creation of man. And man relating to each other. Man and woman. Those are deep themes. And they can, in some ways, be understood by a child, but there are scholars who write books just trying to figure out those first few lines. What you do with this fake complexity index is you can incorporate and you can import anything into the curriculum that you want to because you can stamp it with the word complex. So a couple of my favorites, one is at the middle school level, the evolution of the grocery bag is an informational text. And it does. It goes into how grocery bags have really evolved. In my day, there was paper or plastic. In fact, we didn't have plastic when I was growing up. And now, the choice at the middle school level is Shakespeare or plastic. And we're giving plastic. So what about this article? This is the last text that's actually mentioned in Appendix B, which is a recommendation of the text. Written in the 2009 New Yorker by Atul Gawanda. The Cost Conundrum, Healthcare Costs in McAllen, Texas. Does anybody remember why we were talking about healthcare in 2009 in the summer? So this is how you import a positive appraisal of Obamacare into your English curriculum and say that it's complex and it's going to prepare them for college and career. See the sleight of hand that's taking place? Well, it gets even worse than that. There are several things that I would say on that front, but the problem is, once you set this thing up, then you're bowing to this god of complexity so on, and you're trusting in the people who are behind the Common Core to tell you what a good text is and what a good text isn't. And then that's where you get, and also what they're also programming into it is there are going to be fewer stories because, of course, we live in a 21st century global economy. That's what takes us to Appendix B. Appendix B is the list of recommended texts, where they actually say you should read this book, this book, this book, and so on. You should take a look at Appendix B. You really should. It's confused a lot of people, I admit. Because if you go to it initially, you'll find some good names there. You'll find Shakespeare. You'll find Twain. You'll find Ronald Reagan. And until you can break the code, it's not clear what's going on in Appendix B. And this is part of what I try to do with my book as well as I can, there's a lot of mischief that's taking place in Appendix B. Number one, when you look at the early elementary stories, remember these complex texts that they were going to be reading at the high end of the band? They're silly. There's no, if you start looking for classic literature, you will find no Hans Christian Andersen. You will find no Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. You will find nothing in the way of classic fairy tales. I think they have one fairy tale told from a Chinese perspective and one kind of made-up, new version of Little Red Riding Hood, in which Little Red Riding Hood blows the wolf away. But not the real story itself, right? And instead, what they have are these forgettable books, most of which were written in the 90s or later. One book is called Tops and Bottoms, which is at the second grade level or third grade level. And when you look on the Amazon page, you find out that it's actually recommended on the Amazon page for ages 4 to 8. It's the kind of thing you would read to a 4-year-old even prior to going to school, and that's replacing The Emperor Has No Clothes. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Common Core has no clothes. And I think there's a reason they don't want us to read that story. When you get up to the middle school and high school level, there are a lot of things that are going on where there's mischief. Number one, I find nowhere in the standards, and I've had a lot of, especially Catholic parents, who have taken this to their principals and have asked, where is there any religiously inspired literature at all in these recommendations? There's no John Milton. Although the Common Core claims to like autobiography, there's no Augustine's Confessions. There's the landmark first great autobiography, not there. Nothing inspired by religion. No sermon, even though they say that different kinds of oral delivery need to be studied as a genre. There's no sermon. No Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which used to be read in almost every high school in the country. There is no Benjamin Franklin in the Common Core. Even though they claim to be, trying to produce scientific, real-world, practical minds, can you think of a more practical, real-world, common-sense mind than that of Benjamin Franklin, who happens to be a founding father and who happens to discipline himself when young and to embark upon his own education? That used to be read in my grandfather's day in almost every high school in the country. And somehow this great committee of experts came together and couldn't put anything of Benjamin Franklin in the standards. I think it's because Franklin is the anti-bureaucrat. Franklin did not petition for a government grant before he went out and discovered the principles of electricity. So they don't want a man off government. But it gets even worse because the mischief that they do is pretty tricky. For example, if you look in the middle school standards, you'll find that they recommend a part of the Constitution. And again, this is in the English class. They recommend the preamble and the First Amendment. Not the whole Constitution. Not the Second Amendment. Not the 10th Amendment. But they recommend some of the Constitution. So we could say, well, maybe this is just because of literature, they're studying the style, the rest of it will be studied in history, hopefully. What they don't tell you, it's on the page, it's page 95 of Appendix B, 2 inches down below where they tell you to study these selected parts of the Constitution, they have a modern author whose name is Linda Monk, who's written a book called Words We Live By, Your Annotated Guide to the Constitution. And a selection from her book is in there reflecting upon the Constitution as it was written. Here's how this selection goes. The first 3 words of the Constitution. I am reading that. The first 3 words of the Constitution are the editors of the Common Core just didn't do a very good job. The first 3 words of the Constitution are the most important. They clearly state that the people, not the king, not the legislature, not the courts, are the true rulers in American government. Think about that. Was there a king in American government in 1787? Not still. This principle is known as popular sovereignty. Okay, so far so good. Second paragraph. But who are we the people, in quotes? This question troubled the nation for centuries. As Lucy Stone, one of America's first advocates for women's rights, asked in 1853, quote, we the people? Which we the people? The women were not included, end quote. It goes on. Neither were white males who did not own property, American Indians, or African Americans, slave or free. Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African American on the Supreme Court, described this limitation. This is Marshall. For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution. For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need look no further than the first 3 words of the document's preamble, we the people. When the Founding Fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of America's citizens. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 could not have imagined, nor would they have accepted, that the document they were drafting would one day be construed by a Supreme Court to which had been appointed a woman and the descendant of an African slave. Translation? The founders were racists, and sexists. Now, the factual inaccuracies in this statement are incredible, and I could go into them, and it would take a little bit of historical doing to do so. But, for example, the Constitution itself, if they're talking about the franchise in terms of who includes we the people, where is the franchise discussed in the Constitution? Article 1, Section 2. Nobody is prohibited from voting in the Constitution. And at the time that the Constitution was ratified, there were both women in certain states and black men free who could vote. No amendment was needed to give women the vote to the Constitution. The states were doing it even before the Constitution was amended. So, but the point is, and we won't go into the historical lecture behind this, the point is they want to brand the founders. Why? So that we don't have to take the advice that the founders ever gave us about government or about education, as Jamie Gass has pointed out. Because the founders had very distinct ideas about what an education is. We can just dismiss that because they were just a bunch of rich, white, racist slave owners. So that's the way to take out the founders. You take out the founding fathers, you take out religiously inspired literature. What do you have? Well, the old way of talking about our culture was to say that we are the descendants of two parents. Greece on the one hand, Rome on the other. Or Athens on the one hand, and Jerusalem on the other. You take away Jerusalem, you take away the founders, and especially the classical tradition, that makes us cultural orphans, which is what we become. And once you're that, then they can introduce any kind of stories that they want to refeed our souls, so to speak, and reshape us. Okay, well, let me give you a couple of examples of this. This is, I used some of these examples several times, but this is one of the things that I think they're up to. This is an example of a real literary text, and I admit that it's a literary text. It was famous in its day, infamous in its day. But it's a short story by Kate Chopin called The Story of an Hour. This is a favorite in the Common Core textbooks. And it's about this woman who is named Mrs. Mallard, and she is informed one day that her husband has been killed in an accident. Pretty bad, right? Well, what she does is she goes into a private room, she tears up for about a second, and then she stretches out her arms and looks into the future, which is hers alone, with expectation. Right? Well, if it is a literary work, we can certainly ask questions about it. The question I would like to ask in a literature class is, how would you like to be married to Mrs. Mallard? But those are not the kind of questions that the Common Core textbooks ask. No. Here's what they ask. Which part of the paragraph illustrates Mrs. Mallard's independence? This is in the textbook, it's in the margin of the textbook, in a Pearson Prince-Hall textbook, the Common Core logo. Which part of the paragraph illustrates Mrs. Mallard's independence? Answer, her independence becomes clear when she spreads her arms to welcome the future. It is hers alone. Ask students, what does Mrs. Mallard's action symbolize, and how does it affect readers? Possible response. The action symbolizes Mrs. Mallard's desire for independence. Readers are forced to reflect upon the negative aspects of 19th century marriages. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't 19th century marriages sort of like marriages? So this is the kind of literature that they're trying to get into the curriculum, right? Think about yourself as a 17, a 16-year-old girl with dreams of meeting Prince Charming, with ideas that you want to find love, that you want to have children, that you want to have a family. And you're given this kind of schlosh day in, day out. It has an effect upon your soul. The folks who are behind the Common Core have to know that, right? And this is the sort of thing that they're doing. I could go through all the different biases and things that I found in the textbooks. But it's actually embedded in the Common Core standards themselves. They were trying to rewrite history, and they're trying to rewrite the stories that young people learn. One of my favorite examples is what they do to Ronald Reagan, where they essentially, how much time do I have exactly? 2 minutes. I don't have time for that one. You just have to read it in the book. Okay, I have 4 minutes. Common Core math, that's it. Okay, so here's what they do. Okay, I promised I was going to say something about Ronald Reagan. When you look in Appendix B, you find Ronald Reagan's name, giving a speech. And that's okay. It's okay to have a speech in a literature class because you're studying it as a genre of rhetoric. That's okay. If you were to have one of Ronald Reagan's speeches in your English class as a model speech, which one would you pick? Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Second choice, I think, would be his first inaugural. Some people want to go all the way back to 1964 and his time for choosing speech, but these are his top 3 speeches ever. Maybe fourth would be his farewell address. None of those speeches are the speech that they recommend of Ronald Reagan. The speech that they recommend of Ronald Reagan is this unknown speech that he gave at Warsaw State University. Why? Well, it doesn't become obvious. You don't actually figure out the clue until you look in a Common Core textbook, in which you find, in a unit on the Cold War, an editorial from the New York Times, 1999, on the 10th anniversary of the fall of the wall. And this editorial begins, "The Berlin Wall was bound to fall eventually." You remember how many times the New York Times was saying in 1980, yeah, the wall is going to come down any minute now. So at any rate, that's the first line. The Berlin Wall was bound to fall eventually. But that it came down as bloodlessly as it did 10 years ago this week is largely a tribute to one leader. Today, Mikhail Gorbachev is a political pariah in Russia and increasingly forgotten in the West. But history will remember him generously for his crucial role in ending the Cold War and pulling back the Iron Curtain that Stalin drew across Europe in 1945. Reagan's name is not mentioned in this New York Times editorial, surprisingly. But 20 pages later, not in the unit on the Cold War, in which Reagan is never mentioned, you do have this obscure speech from Warsaw State University, Moscow State University, introduced with this in the textbook. So this is the editor's writing. Led by Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviets were blazing through the greatest changes they had seen since the 1917 revolution. Although reforms were rapidly taking root, they were not far enough from communist ideology for Reagan. In this excerpt, notice how Reagan restrains his strongly anti-communist sentiments while still extolling the ideals he represents. So that's how you remember Reagan, right? Constantly restraining his strongly anti-communist sentiments and not getting in Gorbachev's way so that he could bring down the wall, which he was going to do anyway. The children who would be reading this as sophomores in high school are 16. Common Core math, what's their birthday? Okay, nobody gives me an answer. I think it's 1998. The point is, unless they've talked a lot to their parents or their grandparents, they don't know a thing about Reagan. And so history is being rewritten. The story is being retold, and the story is within our living memory. This isn't something distant. This isn't the Great Depression. This is something we knew and saw, and it's being retold in front of our very eyes. So you take away Shakespeare. You take away Mark Twain. You give false ideas about Reagan. You replace beautiful stories like Pride and Prejudice, which, you find the name Pride and Prejudice in the Common Core standards. You will find it. When you go to the actual textbook, it's nothing other than a recommended read. And in the volume that is the British tradition, Pearson Prentice Hall, they have a letter of Jane Austen to her niece. And they essentially try to turn her into some kind of feminist. Jane Austen. I kid you not. That's what they're doing. They're retelling the stories because remember, whoever controls the narrative, whoever controls the stories, controls the society. And if you can't see that, the parents see it. But if you can't see that as a state legislator, or as a superintendent of schools, or as a teacher, then you're about to be hit by a truck that is the Common Core. And that's not going to be a very pretty sight. But I think there are a lot of people who are willfully ignorant of this and what's going on. But the sad news that I have, this is all pretty depressing. Jane Robbins, every time we're on a committee together, she says after I speak, she wants to go jump out a window. Because she has such beautiful and wonderful things to bring us, like data mining. But the thing that you have to understand is that this is not even the worst. The math standards and the English standards were supposed to be the non-controversial subjects that they were going to get into the schools so that they could then trot out the science standards and the history standards. And the history standards are even worse. Because after they go through the history standards, which are bogus, they then give you an example. How would we apply this particular lesson in history? What historical event would we use in order, and the standards are bogus just like they are in the English standards. But let's apply this to a real historical scenario. Which historical scenario do they pick? Do you know? Take a guess. World War I, World War II, the American Revolution, the Civil War, you would expect those. No. The Great Recession. As in the recent Great Recession. I, for one, did not know that you could talk about the Great Recession in the past tense. But it's very clear that what they want to do in the standards, and they bring out psychology, which should be a good thing, but it's often a misused discipline. They bring out psychology and they bring out sociology, and they say, look at the effects of different classes of people that the Great Recession had on different classes of people. And better yet, go out into the neighborhoods with clipboards and see what effects the Great Recession had on people. Of course, who was the architect and the cause of the Great Recession? Bush. Who got us out of the Great Recession? Okay, so children out in the communities with clipboards figuring out how people were adversely affected by the Great Recession. Is that the study of history? Or is that community organizing 101? Those are the standards that are going to come when they hope we finish talking about math and English standards. Folks, we got to care about our stories. And we got to take them back. We got to take our stories back. We have to take our schools back. And I hope that's a road to taking this nation back.